Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we are back to Brexit. The UK government look like securing another deal from Europe, but can they sell it to the House of Commons? We interview a top panel of MPs on whether Boris can pull a last-minute rabbit out of the hat to win the parliamentary assent which eluded Theresa May.
I would say that there is a change of mood within the Conservative Parliamentary Party, and some of these hardcore recalcitrants who were voting against the deal, of course, are now moving towards supporting whatever the Prime Minister brings back.
And all of this might happen on Super Saturday. Not a footy show with Jose Mourinho, but the first Saturday sitting of the House of Commons since the Falklands War in 1982. And we take the view from Northern Ireland, which once again is at the epicentre of whatever deal can be agreed with Europe and in the House of Commons.
The big problem we have with Brexit is that Brexit has shattered the relationship between unionism and the UK. And unionists who were dependent on the UK and loyal to the UK for generations are now wondering just how loyal the British government would be to them in a crisis.
But first, let's look at your views on our programmes on the homelessness crisis, one of the many great issues which has been left in the political shadows by the Brexit debate. We have focused on those taking practical action, first in the Brixton Soup Kitchen, and then the initiative to use iconic London buses to help the homeless. And this is what you had to say. Susan says, compassion and Reiki in solutions to homelessness. Right on the money, Alex Salmond Show. Susan also goes on to say, what, no loving cups for the ladies? Yes, we did indeed pass them a quick. Do not worry, Susan. Gordon says, 2 great instalments on a delicate subject. Thanks to all that took part. And best of luck to everyone in their futures. Humanity over profit. Absolutely, Gordon. Donald says, brilliant way of finding future drivers. And of course, Donald is alluding to Stagecoach's offer to those who are involved in buses for homeless getting back into the driving seat in work. Donald goes on to say, I remember saying years ago to refurb buses to help homelessness in cities and rural areas. I would like to see them mobile, picking up those in need during winter months. Well done to those folk making it happen. Slange. Doug says, it's the greed and inhumanity of the political elite that enhance the situation. Start emailing your MP today. And finally, Jimac says, you work your whole life paying into a system designed to impoverish you. We should each see our own fund grow and be able to draw on it if we need the help. But now it's back to Brexit and back to Ireland. An apparent breakthrough between Boris Johnson and his Irish counterpart, Leo Varadkar, just 1 week ago at a country house in the Wirral. But the politics of Brexit back in a spin. The choice suddenly moved from no deal or no deal Johnson to a possible deal with deadlines looming. Instead of dying in the last ditch, the Prime Minister might just pull off a deal at the last gasp. To add to this drama, on Monday, we had a full parliamentary opening and a Queen's speech, where Her Majesty the Queen reads out a speech written by her Prime Minister. This is a ceremony which you expect to see at the start of a parliament when a newly elected government unveils its programme, with accompanying pomp and ceremony. It is indeed unusual to have one in a minority parliament where the government might just have a matter of weeks to run and where the Queen's speech itself will be difficult to carry through the Commons. This is how the debate shaped up.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, my government's priority has always been to secure the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union on the 31st of October. My government intends to work towards a new partnership with the European Union based on free trade and friendly cooperation.
Quite simply, Mr. Speaker, because we don't trust the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, this government has had 3.5 years to get Brexit done, and they've failed. The only legitimate way to sort Brexit now is to let the people decide with a final say.
I think there are people in this entire country are yearning for this House to come together, to work together and get Brexit done. And if we can get a deal, I think it will be the will of the people of this country for us to move that deal forward.
We have entered very dark days. Mr. Speaker, in just 17 days, the UK is set to leave the European Union. I want to take some time to reflect with the House on why the actions of this government are leading to such a tragedy.
Even the Queen today managed to include something to make us all laugh when she said, the government's new economic plan will be underpinned by a responsible fiscal strategy.
The government will now face key votes in the next few days, which will determine not just the direction of Brexit, but whether it can stay in office. However, first we go to Ireland to understand why, for a time this week, the hitherto intractable problem of the Irish border suddenly appeared within sight of a solution, or at least a solution of sorts. Alex speaks to Alasdair McDonnell, the former leader of Northern Ireland's SDLP.
Well, from Belfast, welcome back to the show, Alasdair.
Thank you, Ali. Great to talk to you and great to be on your show again.
Now, were you surprised last week to see the emerging semblance of an agreement with the meeting, the secret meeting between the Prime Minister and the Taoiseach of Ireland?
Well, I think nobody is surprised anymore. Everybody's just frightened and intimidated by the horrific mess that this is. Brexit, there is no good Brexit for Northern Ireland. We had built up a fairly good economy over the last 40 years. A lot of that was to do with us building better relationships through a group called Intertrade Ireland that was set up particularly in the back of the Good Friday Agreement. The Northern Ireland economy and the Southern Ireland economy had become more and more integrated. The problem we have with Brexit is it's going to tear that apart. Whatever sort of Brexit we have will create barriers and obstacles on that. And so the argument, if you like, the barriers that will be created in the channel between Britain and Europe will be replicated on the island of Ireland, but it'll be between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. And that is very, very damaging for everything, right through from farm produce, meat, lamb, pork, milk. All of that is all going to be threatened severely. That's the context for the discussions last week between Boris Johnson and Leo Varadkar. And I think most people here put it in the context of perhaps we're moving away from the very worst possible scenario to a slightly worse scenario. But certainly there's nobody very enthusiastic.
Now, as a long-term observer of the Democratic Unionist Party and a long-term rival, you've seen them over the years. Their uncharacteristic silence this week is that a sign that a deal is about to be done, or does your antennae tell you something different?
Well, I'm not sure where the DUP are, because they have been hook, line and sinker in the Boris Johnson camp. And the problem is this, that the vast majority of the agricultural interest, the farming interest that they would lean heavily on for voting support, and indeed the unionist business interests, they are now very firmly opposed to a no-deal Brexit, or indeed a bad deal Brexit, and they're very concerned about Brexit. The DUP has to some extent strained the relationship, not with their own voting base and with the general public in Northern Ireland. And I think they're caught between a rock and a hard place, because anything they say or do now is going to contradict what they said a few weeks ago. And I think they have thrown their lot in with Boris, and they now find that Boris is letting them down, to put it mildly, that Boris is suiting himself and hanging them out to dry.
Now, Alasdair, you've been a long-term pioneer and exponent of cross-community cooperation and dialogue in Northern Ireland. Is there any sense in which the threat of Brexit has actually brought people together across the communities facing a common economic danger?
The big problem we have with Brexit is that Brexit has shattered the relationship between unionism and the UK. And unionists who were dependent on the UK and loyal to the UK for generations are now wondering just how loyal the British government would be to them in a crisis. And we see articles appearing in the Telegraph and various places talking about the subvention that Northern Ireland gets and how it is on a par with the subvention that goes to the EU. And all of that is destabilising and threatening. And running at the back of it, we've got threats coming in from loyalism, loyalist paramilitary organisations, that if Brexit is not to their liking, that they will go on the rampage again. So there's a lot of undercurrents and overtones out there that are basically very, very worrying.
Final question, Alasdair. As a constitutional nationalist, do you get the sense that the Westminster process and bungling of Brexit has actually opened the door to changes in Scotland and changes in Ireland as well in the long term?
There's absolutely no reason why, Alec, that Northern Ireland cannot be part of the Irish economy on the island of Ireland and still be attached, if unionists so want it, still be attached politically to London and govern from London. But the point is this, they're fighting so hard, and the DUP are fighting so hard to be absolutist in this, that they won't give an inch, and the result is it's all counterproductive, and I feel their efforts will lead ultimately to the breakup of the very union they're trying to preserve.
Alasdair McDonnell with the Harland Wolf cranes in the background. Thank you very much from Belfast.
And if anyone can tell us whether Brexit will happen, when it might happen, with or without a referendum, and before or after a general election, then it's today's panel of independent-minded MPs. Speaking with Alex outside the Palace of Westminster.
Well, you join me outside the Palace of Westminster. You may hear the occasional helicopter overhead. That's because they're keeping an eye on three of the most independent-minded members of Parliament in the entire House of Commons. I'm joined by Daniel Kawczynski, by Chris Williamson and Angus MacNeil. Now, Daniel, can I come to you first? The Queen's speech was a bit of a brass neck, was it not? I mean, you and I have seen many Queen's speeches. They're meant to be newly elected governments announcing the programme they're going to take forward, not a fag-end government without a majority. Wasn't it a bit of a brass neck?
Well, I don't think so. I think obviously the new Prime Minister wants to demonstrate to the electorate that the Conservative Party has ideas should we be re-elected to office. We've had gridlock and paralysis in building behind us for the last year. This constant Brexit merry-go-round is starting to infuriate our electorate. They want us to get back to bread and butter issues which affect their day-to-day lives. And so clearly outlining what a future Conservative government will do in terms of investment in public services is something very, very important.
Chris Williamson, I mean, it may have been a bit of a pantomime, and of course the Extinction Rebellion are all around us, hence the sirens we hear. But it worked, didn't it? I mean, you know, this is a government with a minority or a majority of -40, but they still got the Queen to read out the programme, and it's business as usual, and there's not much the opposition did about it.
Well, look, Daniel said that they've got some ideas, but they're the wrong ideas, in my opinion. I mean, he talked about the National Health Service, but it was all jammed tomorrow. There was warm words about social care, but no real kind of the meat to the proposition there. And I'm very concerned about the proposals around voter ID. It seems that they're taking that straight from the Republicans' playbook in the United States of America to try and depress the sort of turnout at elections for voters who might vote for progressive political parties and enable the Tories to win by default. But in the end, as you say, it is a bit of a pantomime. This is just a bit of window dressing. We're not going to be able to implement any of this stuff, are we?
Angus MacNeil, when you heard Her Majesty the Queen say, my government will be out of the European Union by the 31st of October, didn't that send a chill down your spine?
I was quickly followed by a tweet, I think, either from the palace or the royal family, saying that this is a speech given to the monarch by the government. It is not the monarch who writes the speech or whatever. There was an immediate disclaimer there, which was followed up. It was also an interesting speech from the point of view that law and order featured very prominently, and we're still uncertain as to whether the Prime Minister will be following the letter and the spirit of the law when it comes to the Benn Act and the departure from the European Union. But, you know, I think from one, and Daniel will be pleased about this, it certainly has got us talking about it here. So from the point of view of talking about what the Tories want us to talk about, we're doing that at the moment. So from that point of view, yes, it was a success. When you bring in your critical faculties into it and see the government with the minority, with the failure, with the fag end that it is, it's probably in the longer run a failure.
Join us after the break, where Alex will ask our parliamentary panel whether Boris Johnson's possible new deal on Brexit will get through the House of Commons, or whether, like Theresa May's old deal, it will get bogged down in the parliamentary quagmire. Join us then.
Daniel, it seems the Prime Minister's moving towards some sort of deal with the the European Union. But that's surely not going to be fully fixed by the 31st of this month. And at the end of the day, he's going to have to ask for some sort of extension, the very thing he said he would die in a ditch not to do.
Well, before I answer that, I just want to make one very important point, which is the reason we can now have debates as to how to fund public services, and we will have a Herculean battle of wills at the next general election over NHS and policing and all the rest of it. But the reason we can actually have this debate is because we have done the heavy lifting, the spade work over the last 10 years to reduce the annual structural deficit. When we came into office, and Alex, you have to check these figures yourself, but when we came into office, this country was borrowing £140 billion a year. We've now got that down to about £25 billion a year. For the first time, we're moving towards running a balanced budget. And I don't apologise for that, because I want your listeners to know we spend more than £40 billion a year paying the debt interest charges on our debts, which is money which could be going into public services.
I've heard that Philip Hammond is congratulating the new Chancellor on the early success of his policies. But can we get on to this? Is Boris going to die in a ditch, or is he going to follow the law?
Look, I speak as the first ever Polish-born British Member of Parliament, and I go to Poland a lot to talk to them and other countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And their message to me is we're just perplexed and rather bewildered as to why you can't seem to fulfil what your electorate instructed you to do. And many of businesses in my constituency of Shrewsbury who actually export to the European Union say to me, just get on with it. What's really irritating for us is the uncertainty and the delay. So I don't want another extension. I don't want us kicking this can down the road. We've been sent an instruction by the British people. We need to pull out on the 31st of October. And as you know, Alex, the European Union always tends to do deals at 1 minute to midnight, and I don't expect any deviance from that strategy on this occasion.
Now, Chris Williamson, isn't there just a sense this week that the opposition may have missed their chance? You know, when Boris Johnson was bleeding on the carpet, having been found to have acted unlawfully by the Supreme Court of Scotland, then the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, wasn't that the moment to finish him off and get someone else in?
And I think, frankly, what we need is a socialist vision for Britain, a vision where we invest in our economy, we deal with any economic impact on leaving the European Union through a big fiscal stimulus. We can do that because we have our own sovereign country and central bank. And by doing that, you can create an economic virtuous circle. You invest in our infrastructure, you invest in renewable energy, you invest in our public services, you put money in the pockets of ordinary working people in this country, and they will spend it, and you create that good society. But I frankly think it's only going to be a socialist alternative that will actually enable us to actually deliver that.
Now, Angus, Brendan, MacNeil, with the helicopters above keeping an eye on the honourable member from the Union year, the SNP have invested a lot of their time in trying to save England's position within the European Union. Isn't there a sense if Boris pulls off a deal that he'll have shot your fox? He'll have pulled off a deal, and the SNP arguments to stay in Europe will be to no avail.
I'm frustrated. We aren't at the situation. We haven't kicked off a campaign yet. We haven't maximised the opportunity. And if there is a hard Brexit on the 31st of October, there is no plan for Scotland, as indeed there wasn't on the 29th of March. And I would disagree with Daniel Kawczynski. This date of the 31st of October set by the European Union is not a few minutes to midnight. It's now 4 in the morning. Midnight passed on the 29th of March, also a date set by the 2 years of the Lisbon Treaty as well. So we've got a situation where the Brexiteers are trying to get the UK out on the 31st of October, something that didn't turn up on the ballot paper, a date unmentioned in June 2016. But they will do economic damage. Can Scotland rescue itself from the carnage that the Tory Brexiteers are going to create? This is a very open question. It's one I would not like to pronounce upon too much publicly, but I have my private fears.
Daniel, this emerging deal, which may or may not be voted on this coming weekend, is beginning to look suspiciously like one of Theresa May's early deals, a special case for Northern Ireland, the rest of the country in a much looser relationship with the European Union. I caught a sight of Mrs May the other day, sitting in the back benches, looking pretty stony-faced. I mean, hasn't she got good reason to? The people who refused to vote for her deal now seem quite enthusiastic about roughly the same thing from Boris Johnson.
I think let's wait and see what the final deal is before commenting on it specifically. But I would say that there is a change of mood within the Conservative Parliamentary Party, and some of these hardcore recalcitrants who were voting against the deal, of course, are now moving towards supporting whatever the Prime Minister brings back, because quite simply we're coming under a lot of pressure from our local association party members. I voted for the agreement on the third time of asking because so many organisations in my constituency connected with farming, Shropshire NFU, my local councillors, my local party members came up to me and said, and normally they just leave me to get on with it. But this is the first time in 14 years of being a Member of Parliament that they came to me collectively and said, we know you have concerns about this deal, but for goodness sake, just vote for it, because we just can't stand the ongoing delays. And I think there's going to be more of that sort of pressure building up now for those recalcitrant Tory MPs from the ERG who thwarted Mrs May's deal. I very much hope so. I think most of my electorate are sick and tired of this now and just want us to get back to doing the things that we were sent here to do.
Yes, Williamson, I mean, it may be unfair and unjust on Mrs May, but isn't there a sense that Boris Johnson's about to pull it off? And where will that leave the opposition if he does so?
Well, I mean, I think for Parliament's sake, for the country as a whole, it's really important that we do try and put Brexit behind us. Hopefully we can get a deal which works in the interests of the country. But as I've already said, the real issue is how are we going to respond to the situation, whether we leave with or without a deal. And as I say, I think with our own fiscal, with our own sovereign currency, we can engage in a big fiscal stimulus to deal with any negative impact of leaving the European Union. And then I think what we should be focused upon is redistributing income and wealth. But of course, the reason why we had a referendum in the first place, I mean, I've never been a great fan of the European Union in any way. I did campaign for Remain, but in the end, it's a capitalist club, isn't it? It's a neoliberal club. It kind of delivers socialism for the rich and the corporate sector. And I think, frankly, the European Union itself does need to reform if it's going to survive. It needs to focus much more on being a social Europe to make sure that it works, because for everybody, ordinary people, because there is increasing dissatisfaction, not just in this country, but around the whole of the European Union. But the reason the referendum was called to try and sort out, the internecine warfare within the Tory party, and they plunged the country into absolute chaos, and we're still in this chaos to this day. So I sincerely hope that we can get some sort of resolution to it, and we can put this whole Brexit debacle behind us and then start to focus on the things that really matter to people: jobs, public services, pensions, this kind of thing, and create that good society that I mentioned previously.
Angus MacNeil, the Scottish National Party riding high in the polls, independents riding high in the polls, but if there's a settlement of the European question, wouldn't that shoot the SNP's fox?
The SNP's position is predicated on our relationship with the European Union changing. Now, if we were to revoke Article 50, if we were to find ourselves back as full members of the European Union, that indeed changes the situation. I don't think we're anywhere near that. The best we can hope for is to be in the single market and customs union. And all the talk there is of a Brexit deal, we have to remember there is no good Brexit deal in comparison to what we've got at the moment. The cost to GDP is quite high. So the Brexiteers are finding themselves in a situation where they can't deliver it. They're going to bring all sorts of difficulties economically to the UK. If they get a deal, and they'll sign for any deal at the moment, it'll be worse than Theresa May's deal. If they sell Northern Ireland down the river, as they would put it, I would put Northern Ireland in a better economic situation. The chickens are still going to come home to roost. At the end of the transition period, the UK will be at the single market, the customs union. All the problems we're worried about at Dover or in Irish borders or in a border Poland and Ireland are then going to come home to roost, because this cannot be solved in an adequate way that's going to leave anybody better off when you have yourself outside the single market and customs union and not joined with your big market.
Must be a bit galling for the SNP benches to see the Democratic Unionists dragged towards a deal which the SNP sees giving Northern Ireland better status than Scotland.
Well, that's a huge problem from our point of view, and that's the reasons we weren't backing Theresa May's deal in the first place. First, it was taking us out of the single market and customs union, not only putting us at a disadvantage in a European and global context, it was also going to put us at a disadvantage in a UK context. So the UK was going to be disadvantaged, and we would be further disadvantaged vis-à-vis Northern Ireland. So there is no good deal in this mess.
Now, in a word, in a sentence perhaps, election, yes or no, before or after Christmas?
I want an election before Christmas. I think we've got to break this logjam.
Chris?
I think it's highly unlikely, in my opinion, that we'll get an election before Christmas.
Angus MacNeil?
I think after Christmas, I don't think Boris is going to get any cut-and-run election before the reality of Brexit comes the way. When the reality of Brexit comes the way, the antidote to Brexit is the reality of Brexit. When that comes the way, and if Boris has an election after that, Boris is toast, because people do not win elections with empty shelves and lack of medicines, and that's where Boris has got a problem.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
It is more than 3 years and 3 Prime Ministers since the Brexit referendum, and yet we still do not know when the UK is going to leave the European Union, on what date and on what terms, and indeed, the leaving itself is still a matter of not just when, but if. We don't know if there'll be a referendum on the deal, and whether such a vote would be before or after a general election. Will there be a deal in place by this Saturday, agreed by both the European Council and the House of Commons? Or will Boris Johnson have to write that famous letter asking for yet another extension to yet another deadline? And these are merely the short-term imponderables. More fundamentally, we don't know if Brexit itself would lead to some kind of long-term economic revival of the United Kingdom, or rather to short-term financial catastrophe, leading to the prospect of political disintegration, with Scotland, Northern Ireland and perhaps even Wales launching the Celtic lifeboats and setting sail for Europe. All we definitely know is that in the course of this week, the betting has shifted from Boris dying in a ditch towards Boris doing a deal. Whatever his detractors say, and there are many, Boris Johnson has attempted to bring confidence and direction to the Brexit side of the argument. However, there is a fine line between confidence and bravado, and it is not clear that the Prime Minister and his spinmeister Dominic Cummings have stayed on the right side of it. Meanwhile, the disparate opposition have their own questions to answer. The priority of the various opposition forces has veered from campaigning for another referendum to seeking a general election, then to stopping no-deal Brexit, to now once again advancing another people's vote. We are surely approaching the final act in the Brexit drama. But then, is that not exactly when to expect one last surprise twist in the plot? Next week, we turn to another vote to take place shortly in the House of Commons, the election of a successor to the formidable John Bercow, the most noted and controversial Speaker of recent times. We ask some of Westminster's most experienced parliamentarians about the qualities required to make a successful Speaker, and take a look at the field for the upcoming contest. But until then, from Alex, me and all of the team, it's goodbye, and we hope to see you next week.